Right. I just want to thank everyone here for joining us for this evening's event. I'm Emily. I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I just want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many upcoming events we're looking forward to is Elizabeth Colbert in conversation with Bill McKibben on Tuesday, February 9th. And if you don't do so already, please consider following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome Gabrielle Glaser and Anna Griffin. Gabrielle is a New York Times bestselling author and journalist whose work on mental health, medicine, and culture has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times, the Daily Beast, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and I could keep going on. She's also appeared on many national radio and television programs, including NPR's Fresh Air, All Things Considered, NBC's Nightly News, and ABC's World News Tonight. Her new book, American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption, explores the untold story of a secret adoption system in post-war America through the dual stories of Margaret and the son David that she tried desperately to keep. Joining her in conversation this evening is Anna Griffin. Griffin is the Vice President for News at Oregon Public Broadcasting. Before OPB, she was a reporter, columnist, and editor for the Oregonian and the Charlotte Observer. So this event also includes a question and answer. There is a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Please use that if you would like to ask a question. If you don't see it, try clicking more. It might be showing up there. As well, if someone has already typed a question that you would also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. That'll make it more likely to get asked. And perhaps most importantly, please consider supporting Gabrielle and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her new book from us. We'll be sharing a purchase link multiple times in the chat this evening. And Gabrielle, Anna, it's such a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having us. Gabrielle, we have a lot to talk about, but I want to start by noting you are having quite the week, a rave review on the cover of the New York Times book review, and now an Oregon girl talking at Pals. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. Really, I'm pinching myself about Powell's especially.
Don't pinch yourself too hard. We got a lot to talk about.
Okay, all right.
This book is really, as Emily mentioned, two stories in one. It is a microcosm story of Margaret Erle and David Rosenberg and their quest to find each other. And then there's a macrocosm story about this adoption industry that developed after World War II and is still kind of being fixed and dismantled. I want to talk about both those aspects, but start with the more personal story. This book begins with you meeting David here in Portland. He's in dialysis. You're a reporter at the Oregonian doing a pretty typical story about interesting story, guy getting a kidney donation from a friend. It's such an intimate moment and it leads to something so much bigger. Why did he talk to you then? And what did he tell you that began this saga?
Well, he wanted to really publicize the notion of living kidney donors. David was an incredibly gregarious. Anybody who's listening to this conversation who remembers him, he was he was larger than life kind of a guy, outgoing, always had the idea that you should do something in order to heal the world. He was an observant Jew who followed the precepts of Tikkun Olam, which is healing the world, and he thought that by publicizing the possibility of living kidney donors, he would help people. But he also told me privately. I came to see him. He was tethered to these tubes, cleaning his blood, sitting in a vinyl chair. Just, I think the dialysis center was in Beaverton actually, and we sat down. I was really surprised that he wanted me to meet him for the first time in such a vulnerable position, but he was just that kind of a guy. He said, it's not like I could be out doing errands. I have to sit here 3 times a week for about 3 hours. So come on by. You can't miss me. And he told me in the course of that first interview that he hoped the story would go viral and that he hoped somehow that his birth mother would see it. He wanted to know more information, he told me, about his medical history for his children. And he left it sort of like that initially.
So not I'm desperate to be reunited with her more. I want information for my kids.
Absolutely not. Although there was something, I don't want to read anything into his motives, but he had this this wistful look on his face, and he started to tell me the story of his birth mother. And he said, she was a girl in trouble in New York in 1961. I know that she was Jewish. She wanted me to be raised in an observant home. And that was really all that he knew about her. And he just he sort of put it on his curiosity on the topic of medical history. He suffered from a lot of different conditions, and he was quite definite and clear about wanting to have more information on behalf of his three children.
You introduced Margaret Earle and her story. She was 16, I think, when she got pregnant. She had dreams of marrying the father, essentially a high school sweetheart situation, and raising this baby, starting their family. Walk us through what happened instead.
When she got pregnant in 1961, she tried to hide it. At first she didn't even know what was happening. They had had intercourse one time, but that was enough. And she initially believed that her weight gain was the result of too many milkshakes. So she bought some tent dresses. She was a babysitter nearby in her neighborhood in Upper Manhattan, and she saved her money to buy a girdle. And after a while, it was hard to hide. And her mother noticed. She escaped. She fled to a neighbor's house or a friend's house in Queens to try to get some space. And when she came back, it was impossible to ignore. She was pregnant. Her mother took her to the doctor, and that marked the beginning. That visit to an obstetrician in Midtown Manhattan marked the beginning of what would become a lifelong separation. The doctor said, "We're going to help you. Don't worry about this. We'll take care of this. And come back when you're married and pregnant, and I'll come back when you're married and pregnant, and I'll take care of you the second time, and I will conceal that this ever had happened." He referred her to an adoption agency that you might remember from the Triplets movie, if you saw that, about the separated identical triplets. The agency was called Louise Wise Services in New York at the time, in New York State at the time. Adoptions were organized on the basis of religion. So if a birth mother was Catholic, her child would go to a Catholic agency. If she was Jewish, it would go to this one agency, which was the premier Jewish agency pretty much on the East Coast.
It seems like part of the agency's job was to separate these young unwed mothers from their babies and then ensure that they went away and didn't even try to have contact with them in the future.
Oh, absolutely. And the laws were set up that way, mostly in the 1920s and 30s throughout, not every state, but in many states, in New York particularly. And the laws were established to seal off an adoptee from his or her original identity. So they would seal the original birth certificate, issue an amended one once the child was adopted that listed only his adopted name and the name of his adoptive parents as his original mother and father. And the theory, the export version behind the logic for that was that it would protect the child from the taint of illegitimacy. It would shield the mother from the shame of her situation as a unmarried pregnant girl. But most importantly, those laws were established to create a sense of security for adoptive parents to make sure that nobody was going to come interfere with this newly created family.
Margaret essentially began searching for David from the moment she gave him up, really the moment he was taken away from her.
Mhm.
Why wasn't she able to let go?
Well, he was her firstborn son. She was told by everyone around her, "You're going to forget him. Don't worry about this. Just never look back. Make like it never happened." But it's impossible for a woman, in my opinion, to forget a child she gave birth to. Women struggle with the loss of pregnancies that are miscarriages. Those are the trauma from that can be lifelong and extremely difficult to overcome. And losing a child to adoption, and essentially it was a massive loss, a huge trauma for her. And she didn't have a place to put that grief. There are mourning rituals in Judaism that she wasn't allowed to partake in. she lost a child, but she couldn't talk about it. Nobody spoke about it again. Her parents didn't speak about it. No one in her family spoke about it. She did eventually marry George. In fact, she married George very swiftly. They eloped. They did everything they could in their teenage power to try to keep that baby. But the laws in New York State were so predatory that she just didn't stand a chance.
I was very surprised reading the book that they did stay together. They had a family, and it was a very happy life together. Did that surprise you?
When you undergo something like this, such a traumatic experience, I think it is rare for parents to have stayed together. But she and George did. They loved each other. Nothing was going to come between them. And George passed away in the year 2000. So unfortunately, I never got to meet him. But it was really the love story between these two people was really, it was something to behold. It was hushing, actually. And I think nothing was going to drive them apart.
And he, it seems like he was similarly haunted in his own way by this lost child.
Very quietly. Margaret would every once in a while she would try to broach it with him, but he would really sort of shut her down, not in an unkind way, but he would just say to her, what's done is done. We've got these three beautiful other children, and we can't look back. We've got to look forward. And yet they like to go to Atlantic City. They eventually left New York and moved to New Jersey, and they would go to Atlantic City every once in a while to I forget what they played. I don't know what do you play when you give numbers? What
When
game
you
is that?
when you give numbers,
Well,
I, I
she had her special numbers when she was betting on horses as well, and he always knew that the numbers that she would choose were the dates of David's birthday.
someone in the audience tells me that's roulette. I'm a craps player,
Thank you.
so
Okay. All
I'm
right.
told it's
Thank
roulette.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I hesitated for a second. I'm not a gambler. So,
Just a reminder that if you have a question, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to leave some questions. We're going to leave about 20 minutes at the end of this to ask those. Let's get back to Margaret and David. They did eventually end up finding each other. How?
they did through a series of small miracles. Kim Danish Rosenberg, who is David's widow, gave him a DNA kit for his birthday in 2013. And 5 months later, he had some results. And he had some results with relatives. As you know, adoptees often turn to these direct to consumer DNA tests for information about their family, for their medical histories. And in this case, David met a distant cousin, third or fourth cousin, a woman in Georgia named Sandy Baumwald, who wrote to him. She is the daughter of two Holocaust survivors. She doesn't have any first cousins. Her parents were both only children, I believe. And so she's very, very friendly, gregarious person. And she reached out immediately to David and said, "Hey, cuz, what can you tell me about, great great grandpa Shlomo?" And David wrote back and said, "I can't tell you anything. I'm adopted, and you're the first birth relative I've ever spoken to." And Sandy is an attorney and an experienced family genealogist. And she said, "Do you want me to help you find your birth mother?" And David was hesitant at first. He didn't want to interfere in his mother's life. He didn't want to intrude. He was ambivalent about it. But at the same, and he also was very, very clear that he had loved his adoptive family very, very much. He was cherished by them, and he cherished their memories, and he didn't in any way want to tarnish the love that, or dilute the love that he had for the Rosenbergs who had adopted him when he was in 1963. But Sandy said, "Your adoptive parents are no longer with us. If you want me to help you find your birth mother, I can do it." And it just so happened that indexes in New York State, in New York City, it's very complicated. I'm not going to get into it because but if he had a number that was attached to his amended birth certificate, it would match Margaret's name in a registry of births in 1961. But it was extremely painstaking. It was not it was only alphabetical. I'm not going to go. I actually don't remember exactly how it is, but it was arranged by date and by name. And she's this wonderful Southerner, and she said, "I'm really happy to help you, but I sure as heck hope your last name isn't Zimmerman." So, and luckily, as luck would have it, 3 weeks later, she poured endless pots of coffee and stayed up around the clock searching for clues. And she found a match. She found the match in the numbers that led to his mother's birth name, which was Margaret Erle. And then she searched for her on Facebook, and Margaret had left. It was just a series of crumbs that she was able to overturn to be able to locate his mother for him. And as it happened, Margaret had left her maiden name on Facebook, Margaret Earl Katz. And within moments of finding some clues that had been left that were erroneous, fictitious clues that had been left in his adoption agency file, she was able to find Margaret and found her on Facebook. And David looked at her and immediately saw a family likeness and said, "Yep, I think that's the one. It's got to be her."
And their reunion happened really in the nick of time, given his health.
Yes, David was dying of cancer. He had had diabetes, he had had gout, and he had been diagnosed with thyroid cancer, I believe, in 1999. And it had progressed to, it had metastasized. And he was quite weak. And he called me, and he found Margaret in May of 2014. They connected by telephone. And when they spoke for the first time, I believe they were on the phone for hours, just catching up, like as if they'd always known each other. Margaret was overjoyed. David was stunned to learn that he had been loved and wanted. His whole narrative got overturned in an instant because he had always believed that though he was deeply loved by the Rosenbergs, that he'd been given up, he'd been an inconvenience to his birth mother, that somehow he wasn't wanted. And in an instant, I believe it was the 2nd of May in 2014, he learned that he Margaret had thought about him every single day of his life, that she had tried to find him, that she had tried to leave contact information, and none of that. And most importantly, she had obsessively left information about every single illness that laced through the family tree. She called from payphones. She didn't want there to be any record of the calls, even on the paper bills that we used to receive, that would give you even the record of local calls. She didn't want her husband George to think that she had some sort of disturbing attachment to their phantom son. So she would call from payphones and say, his maternal grandmother has breast cancer, or his paternal grandfather has this. And Louise Wise officials would always say, okay, yes, all right, thank you, we'll pass that on. They never did. They didn't pass on a single shred of information.
And you came to this bigger story because you and David became friends after that initial reporting. Did that cause any qualms for you, writing a book essentially about someone that you were friendly with at that point?
First of all, it was impossible to not become David's friend. He never knew a string. I mean, it was this guy was like, it was impossible. Like, come over for Shabbat. Just
Why
come
don't they
over.
remind this Portland audience who David Rosenberg was? Because I think many of them
Oh,
either
yes.
know him or knew of him.
David Rosenberg was a cantor at the traditional synagogue that was founded by his wife, Kim Danish Rosenberg's ancestors, Sherry Torah. And he had been hired as a cantor from Israel, actually. And he was a beloved person in town. He once sang the national anthem at a Trailblazers game with a Trailblazers yarmulke. And he also was a co-founder of the pizza chain Pizzicato, which everybody knows. He was a well-known person in town. And when, where were we?
I think we were talking about how you came back, how you came to
Oh,
this story, the big story.
Yeah. So David, it was impossible not to become David's friend. And when he called me in 2014, the first thing he said was, I saw it was on the landline telephone, and I saw his name on the caller ID, and I picked it up, and he said, "Hi, it's David Rosenberg. Are you sitting down?" And I said, "Well, now I am." And and he said, "Guess what? I found my birth mother, and she lives 45 minutes from you." He had already plotted it on Google Maps. And he said, "You have to meet her, and she's coming to Portland to meet me." And in fact, she and her youngest daughter, Sherry, David's full sibling again, had become an opera singer in Berlin, a famous and successful opera singer. So these two siblings had each had really successful vocal careers. And they were coming to Portland to meet him. They came in July of 2014 and stayed for 3 weeks, 3 months before he died of some of these very illnesses that Margaret had tried to warn him about.
When did you realize that this was a bigger story than just these two people?
I started searching on Facebook and I saw birth mothers from Louise Wise who had a Facebook group, and they were generous enough to let me join the group, and I began asking questions, and then I met some other birth mothers. One birth mother led to another birth mother. There are birth mother organizations, and one birth mother led to another birth mother, and I began amassing this sense that, not a sense, the reality that this was an enormous story that affected millions of people. And I also built upon the work of a fantastic book called The Girls Who Went Away, that I believe came out in around 2007, which was an oral history of about 100 women who had been sent away. So I knew that these maternity homes, like the one Margaret got sent to, had dotted cities and secluded areas from state to state nationwide. There were more than 100 of them. And once you have that sort of basis of 100 maternity homes and secret adoptions, and this birth mother's experience is very similar to this birth mother's experience, and they all of them were told fictitious stories about the destinations of their babies. And likewise, adoptive parents also had been told fictitious stories about the origins of their children, much like the Rosenbergs, who were led to believe, if the adoption files can be believed, that they presented Margaret as a promising young science student, and that was, patently untrue. She was a dancer and she was in the arts, and they positioned George Katz as a college student who was blonde and or had sandy hair and freckles, and that he was a business major who was poised to join his family business. He was a baseball player who had a college scholarship that he hadn't taken yet to go to Ohio State, but he was over 6 feet, had black eyes, jet black hair, and olive skin.
This was an entire economy built around babies. You and I talked last week, you said in some ways this boom reminded you of a Ponzi scheme. Explain that.
Well, in part because the babies were sold as products, as I was as we as we were just, I when I say sold, but there was a market. I wouldn't say sold. There were services rendered, and the service rendered was a baby. And there were scientific experiments in addition to the separated twins and triplet experiment that are so sinister. I'll get into those in a moment. But parents were, adoptive parents were promised a brilliant child who was the child of a concert pianist. Meanwhile, birth parents were promised, Margaret, for example, was promised that David was going to go to diplomats who wanted to adopt him in the next week. And meanwhile, adoptees who were the subjects of experiments, I'll talk about it in a second, but they had no voice in any of it. So there were adoption agencies nationwide that were acting like puppeteers, And I spoke to several retired social workers who were in the adoption field. And one of them told me, oh, we were in love with our power. We were absolutely in love with our power. We got to decide who was going to become parents and who wasn't. And another one told me that it was like being on the admissions team at Harvard to decide who was going to become a parent. And meanwhile, the babies, the sons and daughters of these women were completely voiceless and powerless. They were in the custody of their adoption agencies who decided who to put where and when.
And it's not just babies being taken from their biological parents and essentially being hidden from them. It's also, as you mentioned, babies being in the process used for experiments, scientific experiments. I what was the worst thing you heard in reporting this? Because it reads like a horror story in some points.
Well, it is a horror story. In 2018, I'd written a piece for the New York Times op-ed page talking about the human and civil rights violation of not of adoptees, adult adoptees not having access to their original birth certificates. And in the process of that, I met two adoptees in particular, one in New York, Tim Monty Wolpart, and a Texas adoptee rights activist named Shauna Hodson. And I became quite friendly with them. And Shauna and I began speaking. And at one point, she called and said, I've got some really crazy information to tell you, but Louise Wise was involved in far more sinister experiments than just the twins and triplet one. And the more we talked, the more we investigated together. Once she tipped me off, I was obsessed with the following. And there was a pediatrician, again, a pediatrician in charge of child welfare, who was on the board of Louise Wise Services, who had the harebrained idea that babies who cried the most were the most intelligent. How do you measure such a thing? Well, his name was Samuel Karelitz, and he decided so humanely to rule out prodding a baby with an electric prod or with a heat prod. So instead, researchers developed a rubber band gun that I actually have photographed from an ancient, JAMA article. Shoot that shot a rubber band, a thick, like the kind that comes around a big stack of mail, a thick rubber band at the foot of a new 10-minute-old newborn, and then their cries would be measured. And if the baby didn't cry loudly enough the first time, researchers were told to continue this experiment 7 times. And these experiments went from 1957 until 1972 or 3. They were funded by the NIH, and they were heralded, they were embraced as a wonderful tool for measuring a child's intelligence. And in some cases, the babies who were tested like this for 6 months. And they withheld food. They made sure that the babies were sleepy at their most vulnerable. And then again, I will repeat it, pediatricians shot the infants with rubber band guns. And then this is what the Ponzi scheme was about. Probably, then they would offer them to whoever they deemed to be the most intelligent adoptive parents.
I have to think about the role Judaism plays in this, given that we're talking about Louise Wise. There was an understandable drive to rebuild Jewish families after World War II.
Mhm.
But the methods used by these agencies were impersonal at best and inhumane and reminiscent of some of the things we saw during the Holocaust at worst. How in the world did they justify that?
I think they justified it to themselves by saying, all right, well, we're building a better, a family that even could be, we can even improve on Mother Nature. They too were in love with their science. The only thing that I can think of, I actually ran this by some ethicists, some bioethicists, and one of them said, Maybe the thought that they were doing this, it was sanctioned by the US government and they were conducting these experiments in hospitals. Maybe somehow they justified it to themselves that, okay, well, this is really science. But what perplexed me the most is that after the war, the US signed the Nuremberg Accords, which among the many things that it called for was the establishment of informed consent. And these studies 10 years later were being conducted by Jewish doctors in a Jewish hospital on Jewish babies and other babies. They were taking babies from all over the New York area to conduct these experiments on. But I really have a hard time um, wondering and imagining what went through their heads. I did track down one of the researchers. She was elderly. She was in Florida. She's actually still a practicing um, a research psychologist. And I went to go see her and I spoke to her before. I was very clear about my aims. And I said, I'd like to hear more about Dr. Karelitz. And I see that your name is on at least one of these studies, which are called very blatantly, very openly, induced crying. And she said, all right, okay, if you're going to be in Florida, come see me. So I went to see her. And immediately when I got there, she said, yeah, I just crunched the numbers. Her walls were littered, not littered, but they were decorated with photos of her children and grandchildren. And I said, I tried every reporter's trick in the book. How, looking back, could you have participated in such a study? What was that like for you? I don't remember. I don't remember anything. I don't remember. I mean, I tried everything, everything. She'd clearly lawyered up, but she was as close as I got, and I didn't get that. She was sort of the one who got away.
Did any legit science come out of those kinds of experiments?
It's so interesting that you asked that because I went to the National Archives to try to poke around and see, not to poke around, I was seriously looking um, to see if I could find any data on the original grant proposals, to find out what the original aims of the study were, what the commentary was in giving the grants. And I spoke to I spoke to a couple of researchers there, to archivists there. One who was a QAnon guy who was like had all these conspiracy theories. He probably wasn't that wrong. And next was a completely legitimate guy who took me outside the area where other people could hear me and said, "This is really disturbing. I see what you're trying to tell me, what you're looking for. You're not going to find it. If under the Clinton administration, if scientific grant proposals had not yielded in significant cures or advanced the cause of science, all of the information associated with those was destroyed. That to me is so bizarre. You cannot tell me that there's not enough basement space in this gigantic country of ours that you can't house that stuff somewhere.
Or things we don't want to remember?
Exactly, exactly. It was expunged, not there. Just didn't happen.
One of the underlying themes in the book is the role abortion and the debate over abortion plays in adoption and in this adoption industry that you write about, both before the push to open records and afterward. Explain to us why abortion is something we have to talk about when we talk about the adoption boom.
One thing I want to be clear about is that adoption rates, there's always, this religious argument that the number of babies who are surrendered for adoption is going to decrease in states where abortion is far more available. That's just not true. And there's no data to support that whatsoever. But it is clear in the years before the war, before Roe v. Wade, rather, that women who may have had another alternative may have made a different choice. And one thing that happens today, especially I was in Texas about a year ago before the pandemic, observing some of the legal aspects of the very, very closed state that is Texas. Adoptees have absolutely no right to access their original identities there. And one thing that was really shocking to me, I was with Shauna, and we were driving from Austin to San Antonio and back, and also to some other small town, another small town. And the heartbeat personhood billboards were absolutely everywhere. And pregnant, call this number, we can help. It was as ubiquitous. The advertisements for crisis pregnancy centers were as ubiquitous as anything you as Starbucks, frankly. And in Texas, we all know the woman's right to choose is very limited, and there are massive adoption agencies there that are now really central to domestic adoptions and international adoptions in the United States. The biggest ones are operating absolutely out of Texas. So,
And a lot of this ties back into the debate over open records. It has been almost a quarter century, or maybe a full quarter century, I lose track of time in the pandemic, since Measure 58. That was the Oregon initiative that allowed adoptees 21 and older to access their original birth records. Why was Oregon the place that happened?
that is such a great question. So, the founder of an adoptee rights group called Bastard Nation, um, I believe, lived in the Northwest at the time. Her name's Marley, and I asked her this question. She happens to live in Texas now, and when I was on this trip a year ago, I said, "Why Texas? I mean, why Oregon, and why Alabama?" Because they both opened up at around the same time. And she said, "Oh, it was pretty simple actually. The referendum, the initiative system that is available in Oregon really seemed like a good place to start. Oregon is not a very religious state, as we know. There's not a huge evangelical or Catholic presence. Very progressive voters, and it seemed like a really good place to start. And with the support of birth mothers and other adoptees, it did eventually pass. It took some time. I think it took about 3 years before it actually became law. But Oregon, I'm very proud to say, was indeed the first state to open its records. It must be said also that Kansas and Alaska never closed theirs.
And so Oregon sets a standard for something, is on the cutting edge. We have seen with other issues, marijuana, legalization of cannabis. I think about vote by mail, death with dignity.
That's what they
We've
knew.
we've seen things pass in Oregon, also Washington to an extent, and kind of then become the norm nationally over time. That has not happened with adoption records opening up.
Not yet. It has not. There are really big influences at play. The Catholic Church, for one, in some states, in Massachusetts, in Maryland, and evangelical presence in others, adoption agencies, as I said. And interestingly, death with dignity, marijuana laws, that we Oregonians were pioneers in those initiatives, but it did take time. It really took time for those. How many states have death with dignity now? Washington, Colorado, maybe. It's not a lot. It's not, and I'm not equating open records and death with dignity, but just people's right to choose.
And,
People,
and our attitudes toward life and death.
exactly. Our attitudes toward life and death, and adoption is very much a part of that. Accessing your own stolen original identity, really, I believe, for Oregonians was a no-brainer. And elsewhere, there are these specious arguments. Well, we have to protect the birth mother's privacy. We have to protect I don't know who we have to protect, but that's the old saw in most states. These women were guaranteed confidentiality. They weren't. You can't guarantee someone confidentiality in the future, in perpetuity. That's impossible. And there's no legal documentation to substantiate that.
A lot of the problems you identify from the sort of Margaret's generation of adoption as an industry have been addressed in some form. But there's still a lot of problems with the system. Are there policy changes you hope will come from this book and this conversation?
Oh, I would love to see this become part of the national conversation. I would love to see the rights of adult adoptees be understood as something that, I'll put it this way. I'm going to quote one of my adoptee rights activist friends: equality should be ubiquitous. Why do we have to continually in, infantilize grown men and women from not accessing their original identities? It is ludicrous in the extreme. And yes, I know, as a colleague, former colleague of yours, as a newspaper writer, this is somebody brought this up today. I have crossed the line from objective journalist into advocate because it's absurd, and it's absolutely, in my opinion, unacceptable to continue to have these laws in place.
I would argue that part of the responsibility of being a journalist, certainly a journalist who is doing the deep kind of reporting that you were doing, is to stand up and say, I've identified something that's fundamentally flawed and here's a solution to it. If that makes you
Right.
feel any better.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I have absolutely, I'm very proud of having come out on the other side of this. Initially thinking, well, I gotta, can't lose my objectivity. No, okay, there's no question here. This is wrong. And if I can do one thing to help change this. Oh, and by the way, coming back to David, David asked me specifically, not specifically, I'll go write a book about this, but I said, what do you want me to do? He was telling me about Margaret coming, and he said, I want you to write about it. And I said, well, how? And he said, just make sure this doesn't happen to other people. So I didn't take the prescription from a dying man lightly. It really stayed with me.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Here's one. Since the laws were a major root cause for the circumstances inflicted on these children and these parents, is there any accountability or discussion about reparations for these impacted groups?
That comes up quite frequently, actually. That's a really clever question. Thank you for that. Louise Wise, for example, I know there were many lawsuits. Um, Eventually, the agency sunk under the weight of both a bankruptcy, but also against some of the claims that had been levied against it for the twins and the triplets study, and additionally wrongful adoptions in which they had completely lied and made up stories about the origins of certain birth mothers. Um, so far, to my knowledge, I could be wrong. So far, there has not been large movement to have reparations. It's certainly discussed and understandable, but most of the people involved are no longer with us. Many of the agencies are defunct, and suing the state would be possible, but I don't know how feasible or how easy.
Do you see any parallels to the current world of international adoptions?
Yes, in that many of these adoptees have absolutely no access to their original identities at all. Many of them are told, most of them, particularly folks from Asia, they're told, well, you were abandoned, it was shameful, the one child policy for girls who were abandoned in China, and your mother left you in a rice paddy, and that's all we know about you. And I hear that refrain over and over and over and over again. And I doubt that it's really always true. And knowing what I know about birth mothers and relinquishment, and in terms of rights for international adoptees, many of them, because of the negligence of their adoptive parents, lack citizenship. Once the baby was brought back to the United States, they failed to follow through with the paperwork required to naturalize their own adopted children. And under the Trump administration, it's hard to get those words out. Under the Trump administration, a handful of adoptees were actually deported back to their birth countries, not knowing a single word of Portuguese, not knowing a single word of Korean, and feeling utterly at sea once again.
And it's important. You and I talked about this earlier. It's important to note that American Baby really focuses on white women and white children, but there are a raft of other issues that parents of color and their children undergo as part of the adoption world.
Absolutely. And I focused on white women for this book, mostly because that was the babies of those women, the sons and daughters of those women were the ones who were in demand with the growing middle class. The demand during the baby boom, if you couldn't conceive, was from white couples to white children. And there was a parallel separate experience for women of color, for Black women. Interestingly, many Black women got pregnant out of wedlock too, but their families rallied around them and said, we are not going to be separated a second time. After slavery separated us, after economic circumstances have separated us, we are keeping this baby. And that was pathologized by politicians, certainly the Moynihan Report, which pathologized the Black single mother. Meanwhile, in the late 1960s or in the mid 1960s, when that report came out, the adoption boom among white babies was happening behind closed doors, and nobody was openly criticizing that.
We have a question here from an audience member who gave up her daughter in 1983, who wonders what role you think adoption agencies should play. Should they be trying to help a birth mother keep her child? She notes that a lot of agencies are affiliated with religious organizations that are anti abortion, but it doesn't seem like they offer birth mothers support to keep their baby.
No, and I'm very, very much a proponent of family preservation, and so if a mother is unable for whatever reason, she is mentally unstable or financially in difficult straits, then the adoption agency should help her try to keep that baby. If that woman is unable to raise that child for any reason, then they should be looking into kinship adoption. Who in the family can help raise that child, and how can we support that togetherness?
What was the most surprising roadblock you hit researching this book?
Hmm. Initially, I think because I was an outsider to adoption, I'm not adopted, I'm not a birth mother, I'm not an adoptive parent. I think it took a while to earn the trust of the adoptee rights community. I think I was a little bit suspect at first. What were my motives? Did I have some sort of, and I understand, I completely understand, it's completely legitimate um, reservation. But once I did, I was it took a lot of education actually. I had language that was not sensitive. I had um, I repeated some of the tropes of the adoption mythology that we have in this country. I'm not saying I repeated them in some sort of maybe I was casual about it initially, and I was very patiently and kindly educated about the landscape, and and I did learn. I hope I probably still make mistakes. Of course I do, but um,
Another audience member wonders, you've spoken to a lot of birth mothers, a lot of adoptees. Did you find that people who felt fulfilled or dissatisfied when meeting their birth families and sharing common traits or common characteristics?
yes, overwhelmingly satisfied and a relief. Oh, this is where I get my loud footsteps, or this is why I hate mustard. is why this, these small idiosyncrasies that we have, each of us in ourselves, were are very much alleviated during reunions. But that is not to say for the birth parent and typically the adoptee, but it is extremely complicated for other family members. It is extremely complicated for people who may not have known about the adoption, siblings who suddenly learn that they have a brother or sister that they didn't know about. It is extremely complicated for the families of adoptees sometimes to absorb a new branch of the family that they didn't know about. So it is not tidy. It can be, as I said, it can be extremely gratifying and offer an immense sense of relief. I'm sorry to use that word again, to understand, oh, okay, this is my origin story. This is what I have in my family tree. Oh, I have this cleft chin like Grandpa Ed. And knowing, being able to visualize, being able to see someone who looks like you, talks like you. Adoptees talk about something called a ghost kingdom, and it's the imagined world of people who look like you. What are they like? Where do they live? What are their interests? And so putting real people inside those ghosts is extremely helpful.
I have an audience member who is gave up her baby girl and searched for her for years. 2 years ago, her niece found the daughter because of DNA kits. Wonders if you know anything, found anything in your research about the Florence Crittenden home for unwed mothers.
That was one of the largest nationwide, believe it or not, there were nationwide chains of maternity homes, and they existed from state to state. I think the biggest organization we had in Oregon was the Salvation Army home. There were other chains of maternity homes there, and Florence Crittenden homes. Yeah, they were nationwide, and they operated like low security prisons.
Was there any difference during this baby scoop era between Jewish agencies and Catholic agencies and how they treated parents and children?
I couldn't find a lot of distinctions um, between the three different main branches. All adoptive parents were lied to. All birth parents were lied to. That was pretty straight across the board. And then, of course, adoptees in all three, placed by each religious group, were also lied to. So everybody was lied to. That was the main that was the main takeaway there.
Do you have any lessons or advice for people who are currently navigating their own process of trying to find DNA connections, trying to reach out to birth parents or children they give up for adoption?
There is a very robust adoptee rights community online. There are birth mother groups. There one group that is really, really effective in helping adoptees navigate their search is the American Adoption Congress. There is a group of birth mothers called Concerned United Birth Parents. There are local and regional groups. Bastard Nation is also very, very active in helping people learn their rights. And I think it's just really helpful for adoptees to know that they're not alone, that there are other people like them. It can feel incredibly lonely and isolating to be adopted, to be the only one in your family that raised you who 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 isn't actually a Johnson or isn't actually a, a Rosenberg. And it's important for adoptees to know that there is a really large and helpful community out there.
The wonders of the internet is it does actually help connect people who feel like they're alone.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed.
We are coming to a close. I have one more question for you. Thank you, everybody. By the way, you are getting a lot of thank you for your work in the comments and in
Oh,
the questions. So
oh,
thank you for
thank
your
you.
work.
Thank you.
My last question for you is, does this book, the way it ends, is it a happy ending for this family? Can there be happy endings in situations such as this?
I will say that it's not a tidy ending. I know that Margaret was deeply gratified to have learned that her son had a wonderful life, that he was raised by parents who loved him, that he had every opportunity, that he grew up in 3 different countries. And I think for David at the end of his life, as I said earlier, to have learned that he'd been loved and wanted was really extremely, it brought him great peace. His son Noah told me once. Kim also said that the whole family has mentioned that. But it's really complicated. It's really difficult. There's not an easy answer to that. It's adoption is messy behind the tidy package that it presents itself in. And these reunions are not always easy. In fact, I would say they are rarely easy. I would say far more frequently they are really difficult. Adoption is not finite. It goes on and on. It is multi-generational, and so are its complications.
It is a powerful book, an important book, and a shockingly great read given how emotionally fraught the subject matter is. You should all buy it. Gabrielle, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you both so much for being here. That was heartbreaking and really illuminating, and I'm so glad that I got to hear that conversation. I want to thank everyone out there for joining us, and I want to remind you to purchase a copy of the book if you would like at powells.com. Please do check out our upcoming events, and everyone just take care. Have a wonderful evening.